Part 1. The Calculus of the Impossible, the Dawn of the Atomic Age. December 1942, Stagg Field, University of Chicago. The heart of the Manhattan Project's immense industrial challenge was born not in a factory, but beneath the abandoned stadium seating of a university athletics field. Here, in absolute secrecy, physicist Enrico Fermi and his team achieved the first controlled, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction inside Chicago Pile 1, CP1. This achievement, which ushered in the atomic age, did not signal a scientific breakthrough, it signaled an industrial and logistical imperative. The scientists had proven fission was possible, but the resulting military requirement was monstrous: to transform the microscopic physics of the atomic nucleus into a war-winning weapon on an unprecedented industrial scale. The project was immediately taken over by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, under the command of Brigadier General Leslie Groves. Groves, a man known for his relentless drive and logistical ruthlessness, fresh from overseeing the construction of the Pentagon, understood the task was fundamentally one of industrial engineering, not pure science. "The scientists told me it was like finding a needle in a haystack," Groves famously noted. "My job was to build a factory large enough to process the entire haystack." The unthinkable scale, logistics of the unknown. The core challenge was the scarcity of the key fissionable materials, uranium-235, U-235, and plutonium-239, Pu-239. Uranium-235, natural uranium ore, contains only 0.7% U-235. The remaining 99.3% is non-fissionable U-238. Separating these two isotopes, which are chemically identical and differ only minutely in atomic weight, was deemed one of the most difficult engineering problems ever conceived. Plutonium-239. This element does not exist naturally in usable quantities. It had to be manufactured through the massive, sustained irradiation of U-238 inside large-scale nuclear reactors, followed by highly toxic chemical separation. The Manhattan Project, officially consuming over $2 billion, the equivalent of over $30 billion in modern currency, was thus split into two parallel, competing industrial paths, each requiring the construction of a self-contained, secret industrial city: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, for uranium separation, and Hanford, Washington, for plutonium production. The project's demands on the American industrial base were staggering. It consumed 1% of the nation's total electricity production and utilized nearly half of all Army construction labor and steel during its peak phase. This was not a weapon built in a laboratory. It was a weapon forged by the might of the American Industrial Revolution. The paradox of Oak Ridge, the city of separation. The mission at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Site X, was to achieve the necessary enrichment of U-235 from 0.7% to weapons-grade levels above 80%. Since chemical separation was impossible, three separate, colossal industrial methods were pursued simultaneously, a testament to the urgency and the willingness to commit limitless resources to conquer the unknown. 1. The Gaseous Diffusion Plant, K-25, the long pipe. The K-25 facility was designed to use the principle of gaseous diffusion. Uranium hexafluoride gas, containing both isotopes, was pumped through miles of porous barriers. Because U-235 is slightly lighter than U-238, it would pass through the barriers marginally faster than U-238. The scale. The K-25 plant was at the time the largest single building in the world, covering 44 acres. It housed thousands of stages, cascades of pipes, pumps, and compressors, required to slowly, incrementally separate the isotopes. The problem: the barriers themselves were a monumental engineering challenge. They had to be porous enough for the gas to flow through, but strong enough to withstand the corrosive uranium gas. The initial designs were a near-total failure. The plant was started before the core engineering problems were fully solved, a calculated industrial gamble based on necessity. 2. The Electromagnetic Separation Plant, Y-12, the calutrons. When the K-25 plant struggled with its barriers, Groves poured immense resources into the Y-12 facility, employing a method based on the principles of the mass spectrometer. The system, massive calutrons, California University cyclotrons, adapted for separation, used incredibly powerful magnets to bend the path of electrically charged uranium ions. The slightly heavier U-238 ions bent less sharply than the lighter U-235 ions, allowing them to be collected separately. The demand. The magnets required thousands of tons of copper wire. Since copper was critically scarce for war production, Groves secured the use of 14,700 tons of silver bullion from the U.S. Treasury to wind the magnet coils, a logistical and material substitution of staggering proportions. The silver was used because chemically and electrically it performed almost identically to copper, yet its use was purely temporary, a high-value material investment in the speed of the project. 3. The thermal diffusion plant, S50, the backup. A third process, thermal diffusion, S50, was constructed merely as a backup and a pre-enrichment stage for the K-25 and Y-12 output. This layering of parallel, redundant industrial efforts highlights the Manhattan Project's core philosophy: risk management through infinite material commitment. Every feasible path to U-235 was built to full industrial scale. The massive humming city of Oak Ridge, hidden behind barbed wire and shrouded in steam, was the first concrete realization that the laws of physics could only be conquered by an unprecedented focused concentration of human industry and raw material. The scale was not a luxury, it was the absolute minimum required to pry apart the atoms. The human element, the army of science and labor. The logistics extended beyond materials to the management of an army of people. By 1945, Oak Ridge housed over 75,000 workers, many unaware of the true nature of their task. The separation of command from information was critical to maintaining secrecy. The technicians, thousands of young women, often recruited straight out of high school or college, were hired to monitor and adjust the complex calutron controls at Y-12. They were told they were operating complex scientific equipment to monitor enemy radar. They were performing the delicate, precise industrial work of isotope separation without ever knowing the gravity of the product they were creating. The construction force. Hundreds of thousands of workers were cycled through construction sites across the country, building reactors and separation plants that were quickly enclosed in walls and guarded before they could truly understand the purpose of the massive machinery they had just installed. This vast, compartmentalized, and tightly controlled workforce was the final industrial challenge, maintaining absolute secrecy and consistent production quality across 3 separate experimental industrial processes, all running simultaneously to deliver the few kilograms of U-235 required for the final weapon. The success of Oak Ridge was the success of industrial secrecy and unparalleled organizational logistics. The ultimate product was not just metal, it was a single, war-ending kilogram of power.
Part 2. The Plutonium Engine, Hanford, and the B Reactor. Early 1943, the Columbia River Valley, Washington State. While Oak Ridge pursued the almost impossibly difficult task of separating atomic siblings, U-235 from U-238, the second industrial path of the Manhattan Project was established in the remote, sparsely populated desert of Washington State. This was Hanford Engineer Works, Site W, and its purpose was equally monumental: to manufacture a new element, plutonium-239 or Pu-239, on an industrial scale. Plutonium offered a distinct advantage over uranium. It was chemically different from its parent isotope, U-238. Once created, it could be separated chemically, bypassing the agonizingly slow and resource-intensive physical separation methods of Oak Ridge. However, creating plutonium involved a chain of industrial processes that had never been attempted, requiring the harnessing of the controlled nuclear reaction proven by Fermi's CP1 and transforming it into a colossal, continuous engine of fission. We needed a machine capable of replicating a star's heart, and then we needed the logistical infrastructure to harvest its ash. General Grove summarized the Hanford mission. This was not chemistry. This was the industrialization of nuclear alchemy. The B reactor, the birth of a new element. The core of the Hanford site was the construction of three massive graphite-moderated nuclear reactors, the 100B, the 100D, and the 100F areas. The first and most critical was the B reactor, a leviathan of concrete, steel, and graphite. The engineering challenge was defined by two massive physical constraints: mass and shielding. The reactor required a critical mass of uranium fuel rods, around 2,000 tons of uranium metal, interspersed with graphite moderator blocks. This entire assembly generated intense, lethal radiation, necessitating walls of concrete 7 feet thick around the operating core. The sheer volume of material needed, hundreds of thousands of tons of construction supplies, was a logistical feat in a remote area with minimal existing infrastructure. Heat dissipation. Fission generates immense heat. The B reactor had to be cooled by a constant massive flow of water drawn directly from the Columbia River. The cooling system was a masterpiece of industrial hydraulics, pumping up to 75,000 gallons per minute through the reactor's aluminum tubes to prevent a catastrophic meltdown. The complexity lay in ensuring the cooling water, which became mildly radioactive, was treated and carefully discharged back into the river. The reactor operated by inserting aluminum-jacketed uranium fuel slugs into hundreds of horizontal tubes running through the graphite core. As the uranium, U-238, underwent controlled fission, it absorbed neutrons and transmuted into plutonium-239. December 1944. After overcoming a severe initial operational hurdle, the unexpected poisoning of the reaction by the fission product xenon-135, which required a rapid redesign to incorporate more fuel rods, the B reactor reached its operational power. It began the silent, continuous manufacture of a brand new element on a scale never before imagined. This process alone consumed more than half of the entire project's budget. The canyons of purification. The logistical nightmare of extraction. Once the uranium fuel slugs were sufficiently irradiated, cooked, they had to be removed from the reactor and transported to the separation facilities located miles away for safety. This next phase, chemical separation, was the most toxic and challenging industrial process of the project. The separation facilities were nicknamed canyons due to their vast size and design, long concrete buildings with heavily shielded walls over 9 feet thick. The problem: the irradiated uranium slugs were intensely radioactive, rendering them untouchable by humans. The separation process had to be performed entirely by remote control. The system: specialized cranes and manipulators, viewed only through thick leaded glass or closed-circuit television, performed every step. Dissolving the uranium slugs in nitric acid and then running the solution through a chemical precipitation process. This precipitation separated the minute, precious amounts of plutonium from the massive volume of highly radioactive waste, fission products. The industrial process was defined by scale, danger, and extreme precision. The sheer volume of hazardous waste produced, tens of millions of gallons of highly radioactive sludge, required the construction of massive underground double-shell storage tanks. The successful safe storage of this waste, conducted while simultaneously racing to extract the plutonium, was a logistical triumph that defined the operational limits of the project. The Hanford Canyons represented the ultimate paradox. The creation of a clean theoretical scientific marvel required the operation of a vast, dirty, and intensely toxic industrial processing plant, all managed with the split-second precision of a surgical operation. The power grid and the army of labor. The construction and operation of the three massive reactors and their associated chemical canyons required a mobilization of labor and resources comparable to the entire Oak Ridge effort. Peak labor.
Hanford's population swelled from virtually zero to over 50,000 workers in 2 years, creating an instant city reliant on massive logistics chains for food, housing, and infrastructure. The power grid. The energy demands, primarily for the huge pumps and separation equipment, required the construction of new transmission lines and the integration of power from the Grand Coulee Dam, located hundreds of miles away. The power grid itself became a strategic military asset. Hanford's success was the success of standardization under duress. The engineers had to design and build huge, novel machinery that could not be repaired by hand. Every component, from the fuel tubes to the chemical mixers, had to be engineered for flawless, long-term remote operation, ensuring that the process of cooking and harvesting the plutonium could continue relentlessly without interruption until the required handful of kilograms was extracted. The final product was a dull, heavy piece of metal, but its creation represented a mastery of physics, engineering, and logistics. The successful transformation of raw uranium ore and river water into the world's most concentrated source of destructive power.
Part 3. The Assembly Point, Los Alamos and the Implosion Challenge. Spring 1943, Mesa above the Rio Grande, New Mexico. The third, most secretive and scientifically intense location of the Manhattan Project was Los Alamos, Site Y. While Oak Ridge in Hanford represented the industrial conquest of raw materials, Los Alamos was the nerve center, the scientific factory where the fissile material would be transformed into a functional weapon. Here, led by the intense and brilliant scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer, the project faced its most existential challenge: the physics of assembly. The core requirement was to take the few precious kilograms of U-235 and Pu-239 and assemble them into a supercritical mass, a configuration dense enough to sustain an exponentially increasing chain reaction before the metal blew itself apart. This had to occur within a fraction of a microsecond. The method chosen was the gun-type assembly, which, while simple in concept, proved disastrously inadequate for the plutonium path. We were building a bullet that had to hit another bullet, traveling in the opposite direction in pitch darkness with perfect precision inside a bomb casing, was how one Los Alamos engineer described the gun design. And if we missed, the world wouldn't end, but the war effort certainly might have. The unthinkable discovery, the plutonium trap. Initial research focused on the gun-type weapon for both uranium and plutonium. This design involved firing one subcritical mass of fissile material into another using conventional explosives, forming a supercritical mass. However, in 1944, the Los Alamos scientists made a devastating discovery about the reactor-produced plutonium from Hanford. The Pu-239 contained an unavoidable contaminant, Pu-240. This Pu-240 impurity spontaneously emitted neutrons at a high rate. If the gun method was used with this reactor-grade plutonium, the spontaneous neutrons would initiate the chain reaction prematurely, causing the material to undergo fizzle, an inefficient, weak explosion that would destroy the weapon before the supercritical mass was fully formed. The process was simply too slow. This discovery rendered billions of dollars of industrial investment at Hanford worthless for the simple, proven gun design. The entire project faced a catastrophic bottleneck. The industrial success of Hanford in creating plutonium had created an insurmountable scientific flaw in the intended design. The industrial leap, mastering implosion. Faced with this crisis, the Los Alamos team was forced to execute a frantic, monumental shift in direction, abandoning the gun method for plutonium and committing all resources to the highly complex implosion design. The implosion weapon required surrounding a subcritical sphere of plutonium with a meticulously shaped shell of high explosives, called a lens assembly. When detonated simultaneously, the shock wave had to be perfectly symmetrical, crushing the plutonium core inward to achieve criticality instantly. This was a problem of explosive geometry and manufacturing precision on an extreme industrial scale. The explosive lenses. The shock wave required precisely shaped blocks of fast and slow-burning explosives arranged in a complex pattern,
a structure that had to detonate with spherical symmetry within 100 nanoseconds, or 10 to the minus 7th seconds. Achieving this uniformity required new industrial processes for casting, machining, and testing the explosives, transforming bomb-making from a crude process into a high-precision manufacturing art. The implosion weapon was fundamentally an industrial clockwork mechanism wrapped in high explosives, and its successful development required a logistical avalanche of material and brainpower to solve every micro-challenge of symmetry, timing, and purity. The Trinity test, the final proof. The sheer technical uncertainty of the implosion method demanded a full-scale test. This required coordinating the efforts of all three major sites. Hanford had to deliver the required mass of purified plutonium. Oak Ridge provided the necessary highly enriched U-235 to create the neutron initiators. Los Alamos had to precisely assemble the implosion device itself. July 16, 1945. Alamogordo, New Mexico. The Trinity test was the culmination of this immense logistical and scientific effort. The device, nicknamed Gadget, was suspended from a 100-foot steel tower, representing the final terrifying industrial product of the $2 billion project. Its success was the final definitive validation that the industrial and scientific gamble of the implosion method had paid off. The failure of the gun design had forced the project onto a technically superior yet logistically harrowing path. The final product was a synthesis of industrial material mastery, Hanford, advanced separation, Oak Ridge, and unparalleled scientific engineering, Los Alamos. The successful explosion was a signal that the scientific factory was operational, and the product, the atomic core, was now ready for mass deployment should that prove necessary.
Part 4. The Electrical Empire. Oak Ridge and the Logic of the Calutrons. 1944. The Y-12 Plant, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The Manhattan Project was a race against time and technology, characterized by concurrent, often redundant industrial efforts. While the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant slowly wrestled with the technological nightmare of its porous barriers, the immediate need for enriched uranium-235 was met by a process that was both archaic and futuristic: electromagnetic separation inside the colossal Y-12 facility. This solution, based on the principles of the mass spectrometer, was an industrial triumph of sheer brute force and material logistics. It required an immense centralized power source and the successful substitution of one critical war material, copper, for another, silver. If you asked a physicist what the least efficient way to separate isotopes was, he might point to Y-12. But if you asked an industrialist what the fastest, most certain way was, he would point to the calutrons. It was the triumph of manufacturing scale over physical elegance. The Calutron Army, Magnets and Metallurgy. The calutrons were adapted versions of Ernest Lawrence's cyclotron technology. They used huge, powerful electromagnets to create a magnetic field that would separate the streams of uranium-235 and U-238 ions. The magnetic ring. The magnets were massive, circular assemblies, each weighing thousands of tons. They formed a vast, horseshoe-shaped ring stretching across the factory floor. The scale demanded an energy commitment so vast that Oak Ridge consumed approximately 1/10 of the total electrical power generated in the United States at its peak. The silver substitute. The core challenge was the winding for the electromagnets. The sheer volume of wire needed to generate the required field strength, around 1,200 tons per magnet, was impossible to source in copper, as copper was vital for ammunition casings, communications wiring, and shipyards. General Groves negotiated with the U.S. Treasury to substitute 14,700 tons of silver bullion for copper. This silver, borrowed and accounted for with meticulous governmental paperwork, was drawn from the West Point Depository and rapidly drawn into wire to fuel the electromagnetic separation process. This material substitution was a defining logistical signature of the project, the willingness to co-opt non-military assets of staggering value to maintain the speed of the industrial schedule. The operations. The calutrons separated the isotopes into two distinct beam paths, collected inside specialized pockets. The process was slow, highly inefficient in its use of power, and often required the magnets to be disassembled for cleaning, but it was reliable and scalable, guaranteeing a measurable output of enriched uranium every day. The human component, the unknowing workforce. The efficient operation of the calutrons required the monitoring and continuous fine-tuning of thousands of dials and vacuum tubes. This demanding, repetitive work was performed primarily by a dedicated, compartmentalized workforce of young women, mostly from rural southern communities, who were called calutron girls. They were told they were operating complex machines used to separate materials for the war effort, perhaps for radar or submarine engines. They had no idea they were enriching uranium. Their value lay not in scientific knowledge, but in dexterity, diligence, and precision. They monitored the needles that indicated the ion beam strength and adjusted the controls to keep the two isotope streams separated. The paradox was profound. The most sensitive, scientifically critical phase of the industrial process was entrusted to operators who were entirely ignorant of the physics they were controlling. This strict compartmentalization was the final non-negotiable logistical security measure of the project, ensuring that even if one worker were compromised, the entire scientific key remained intact. The logistical cascade and the final product. The Y-12 plant's role was complicated by the sheer difficulty of reaching weapons-grade enrichment. The U-235 created by the calutrons was only partially enriched. It required a cascading, integrated process utilizing the other Oak Ridge facilities. Initial feed. The U-235 was often first pre-enriched using the S-50 thermal diffusion plant, the backup system. Primary enrichment. This slightly enriched feed was then run through the Y-12 calutrons for the most significant separation leap. Final pass. The resulting material was then sometimes fed back into the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant for final high-purity enrichment. Y-12 acted as the crucial bridge, the high-power, high-material throughput center that could deliver the needed kilograms faster than the more technologically elegant but slower to perfect K-25 system. The cost was immense, the secrecy absolute, and the energy consumption astronomical, but the system worked. By the time the little boy uranium bomb was ready for deployment, the U-235 cylinder that formed its core was the direct, tangible product of the thousands of hands, the vast electrical consumption, and the 14,700 tons of borrowed silver that defined the industrial scope of Oak Ridge. The calutron was the hammer that shattered the final agonizing technical barrier to the uranium path.
Part 5. The Final Calculation. Integration and Legacy. Summer 1945. Tinian Island, North Pacific. The story of the Manhattan Project transitioned from the laboratory and the vast, secret industrial cities of the American interior to the remote operational theater. The ultimate industrial product was not merely the uranium or plutonium itself, but the perfected, integrated logistical chain that transported these hypersensitive, unique materials across the globe for final assembly and deployment. The success of the weapon was a testament to the seamless coordination of three massive, independent industrial arms: the material production, Hanford and Oak Ridge; the design and assembly, Los Alamos; and the delivery system, the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces. The integration of this vast, decentralized enterprise into a single cohesive force was the final daring act of industrial logistics. We didn't just build a bomb, we built a supply line of perfect precision and absolute secrecy that stretched 5,000 miles, observed Major General Farrell, deputy commander of the project. The ultimate weapon was the trust, the certainty that the parts from Tennessee, Washington, and New Mexico would fit together perfectly on a remote island in the Pacific.
The logistical chain of secrecy, the delivery system. The transportation of the fissile cores was arguably the most high-stakes logistical operation of the war. Uranium core, little boy. The U-235 core, which required no testing due to the certainty of its gun-type mechanism, was shipped in a series of lead-lined containers aboard the USS Indianapolis. This fast cruiser sailed independently, relying on speed and secrecy to cross the Pacific, carrying the industrial result of the K-25 and Y-12 plants. The logistical integrity of this single crucial voyage was paramount. Its sinking shortly after delivery underscores the extreme risks inherent in the supply chain. Plutonium core, Fat Man. The highly unstable implosion core required specialized handling. The final plutonium hemisphere was transported separately from the explosive lenses and neutron initiators, requiring multiple, highly compartmentalized flights and ground transfers. The final assembly, carried out by specialized teams from Los Alamos, the destination team, took place in a remote hangar on Tinian. This was the ultimate integration, the merging of the Hanford-produced plutonium, the Oak Ridge-produced neutron initiators, and the precision-machined explosive lenses from Los Alamos. The precision of the final fit was the final definitive check on the quality control and standardization of every manufacturing step that had occurred thousands of miles away. The final form of the implosion weapon, the Fat Man device, was the most complex manufactured object produced up to that time. A perfect sphere of internal explosive lenses designed to crush the plutonium core with femtosecond precision. It was the perfect synthesis of industrial scale and scientific delicacy. The industrialization of knowledge, the legacy. The Manhattan Project, consuming $2 billion, over $30 billion today, and employing over 400,000 Americans at its peak, stands as the most expensive and concentrated industrial effort of the war. Its legacy extends far beyond the wartime climax. The techniques and organizations developed to solve the project's massive logistical and engineering bottlenecks became the foundation for post-war industrial and scientific expansion. Mass spectrometry. The calutrons, initially used for isotope separation at Y-12, established the large-scale industrial application of electromagnetic technology, informing the development of mass spectrometry and particle physics worldwide. Remote handling and safety. The chemical processing methods and remote handling techniques pioneered in the Hanford Canyons for dealing with highly radioactive materials formed the basis for all modern nuclear power and waste management industries. Project management. General Groves's strict, compartmentalized project management protocols and the use of redundant, parallel engineering tracks set a new standard for coordinating massive, high-stakes research and development projects. The project proved that the American industrial system could achieve predictable results from unknown variables by sheer volume of investment and organizational rigor. It was the ultimate demonstration that in the mid-20th century, scientific discovery was ultimately dependent on industrial capacity. The Manhattan Project was not a singular invention, but a total, mobilized industrial system that transformed remote laboratories into massive, humming factories capable of manufacturing an entirely new reality. The end of the war confirmed that the ability to wield such concentrated industrial and scientific power had irrevocably shifted the strategic calculus of global conflict.